Containing North Korea, the world wrestles with the threat posed by its most powerful nuclear bomb test yet. Does a military response risk World War III? What are the other options? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Earlier this week, we spoke of the diplomatic tit-for-tat between the US and Russia. Look to the east, and there's a military one. South Korea has been conducting live fire drills to, quote, strongly warn its northern neighbour, who allegedly launched its largest nuclear test yet over the weekend. North Korea says it detonated a hydrogen bomb underground. It is the country's sixth nuclear test blast since 2006. That's led to a UN Security Council emergency meeting, the second one in a week, and they're considering ways to deter North Korea from conducting more tests. But the UNSC has already imposed stiff sanctions on the country, so what else can they do? US President Donald Trump has a few ideas after the latest North Korea test. He tweeted that the United States is considering, in addition to other options, stopping all trade with any country doing business with North Korea. Well, how feasible is that plan, and what other options are on the table? We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, Wayne Hay has this report from Seoul.
Early on Monday morning, South Korea's military responded to the latest agitation from the north. It was a relatively small answer to North Korea's most powerful nuclear bomb test so far. But by firing missiles at practice targets in the East Sea, the South sent a message that it can strike important locations in the north, such as its nuclear test centre, and its ballistic missile sites, which could carry a nuclear warhead. South Korea's defence ministry says it detected activity at one of those sites, which could indicate another launch is coming soon.
We predict that North Korea could fire another intercontinental ballistic missile to show that they have obtained the means of delivering a nuclear bomb to the United States.
South Korean commanders say there'll be another live fire drill this month, as well as negotiations with the United States to send an aircraft carrier and bombers. The South Korean government knows that direct military action against the north comes with huge risk, but at the same time it feels that a diplomatic response on its own isn't enough. So it wants to put on a show of force. By doing so, South Koreans hope they can pressure their northern neighbour into backing down, something it seems unwilling to do. At the same time, analysts believe it's too late to attack the north.
They have a lot of research facilities. They have produced already a large amount of the nuclear material. Everything is safely hidden, so it's impossible to seriously damage their program but by one or two precision strikes.
South Korea is also improving its defences and deterrent, announcing the full deployment of the THAAD high-altitude missile interceptor system. The partial deployment of the US batteries in April was met with protests by South Koreans concerned about health and environmental risks. Chinese government leaders also oppose the system they say could be used by the United States to spy on China. South Korea's government says it's needed to protect it from attack by North Korea. But the full deployment of the US missile shield is expected to further complicate an already delicate and dangerous situation. Wayne Hay, Al Jazeera, Seoul.
A lot of the pressure to contain North Korea falls on China because of the country's reliance on its Chinese neighbour. Coal is North Korea's main export, and most of it goes to China. In fact, the country is estimated to account for 90% of North Korea's foreign trade. In return, the North receives vital resources such as Chinese oil and food. There's concerns that cutting off those imports would hurt North Korean citizens without curtailing Kim Jong-un's nuclear bomb program. Well, to give us more insight on who can really rein in North Koreans' ambitions and all the other issues raised by this latest test, let's bring in our guests. Isaac Stone-Fish, Senior Fellow at the Asia Society Center on U.S.-China Relations in New York. Victor Gao, Director of China National Association of International Studies in Beijing. and Robert Kelly, specialist on international relations of Asia and US foreign policy in Busan, South Korea. Welcome to the show, everyone. Robert Kelly, if North Korea wasn't taken seriously before, this certainly has changed, hasn't it?
It certainly has. It's not clear to me why North Korea needs a weapon as powerful as a hydrogen bomb. I do think that North Korea achieved nuclear deterrence with just the fission weapons that it had before. It's not really clear to me that they needed to make this step up. I suppose technologically it's possible, right? It's not that difficult to do anymore. The Soviets and the Americans got fusion weapons pretty quickly, but I mean, you don't really need a weapon of this power for sort of strategic defense anymore, right? I mean, this is just about terrorizing civilians, and I think that's why we're talking about this is an extraordinarily powerful weapon. And they just shot a rocket over Japan the other day. I mean, everybody's scared now.
Not only terrorizing civilians, but it seems that he's backed South Korea and the US possibly into a corner.
Yes, I think Donald Trump, to a certain extent, has painted himself into a corner because he talked so tough in the last couple of weeks, right? That fire and fury comment, right? I mean, that was sort of heard around the world. But striking North Korea is hugely dangerous for reasons that have been enumerated very frequently. South Korea is extremely vulnerable to North Korean retaliation. That's one of the reasons why there's never been a response to a North Korean provocation, despite decades of them. And so Donald Trump now, I think, is in sort of an awkward position. He said that he's going to respond in some way, but it's not really clear that he has options that the Clinton administration, Obama, and Bush administrations before him didn't have, or also might not have had. And so I'm not really sure what he's going to do. I think he's sort of put himself into a position now where he's going to end up looking like he bluffed and the North Koreans called him.
That not knowing what he's really going to do, Victor Gao, the psychological game that he seems to be playing, I mean, it seems to be working, doesn't it? He's done very well with the little that he's had.
Well, I would say the situation involving the DPRK's nuclear weapon program and launch vehicle program has really reached a tipping point. And the moment of the truth will come very soon. Either the United States will need to decide to do something very dramatically, or, for example, the status quo on the Korean Peninsula would need to be recognized one way or another by one country or another. Now, as far as China is concerned, China refuses to recognize DPRK as a nuclear weapon country, and China has insisted all along that complete denuclearization need to be achieved as a goal on the Korean Peninsula, and China, Japan, the United States, Russia, South Korea, etc., need to work very closely to create enough momentum and conditions to achieve denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. And right now, I think it's very important for the United States to avoid sending out mixed, confused signals, and the United States need to really be consistent in its position and really consider how to achieve the denuclearization goal, but also how to address the fundamental underlying concern on the part of DPRK about its survival and about the possibility of the United States overwhelming and derailing the political system and regime in DPRK.
A unified response might be the hardest thing here, though, don't you think, Isaac Stonefish?
I do. I think part of the problems the Trump administration has had since the beginning is that it doesn't have a unified voice, and Trump doesn't know whether to listen to Tillerson, to Mattis, to his often unruly impulses, and because of that, we're not getting the kind of policy coherence that would be really useful for dealing with a problem of this magnitude.
I mean, is there a policy in the US when it comes to North Korea? Is there a definitive game plan?
I really hope the answer to that is yes. I think, though, instead there are a lot of different competing policies, different competing ideas. Tillerson, the Secretary of State, seems to want to have a more restrained policy towards North Korea, something involving more dialogue, more openness. Trump really seems to want to, like you said, keep all options on the table, to allow for some sort of very aggressive response. Mattis is kind of moving in between Tillerson's camp and Trump's camp, and I really don't think there is, this is our plan. There's no strategic patience, which is the Obama administration's often mocked strategy of letting North Korea continue to grow its nuclear and weapons capability. But yeah, I don't think there is a there right now.
Robert, you laughed at that. More my question, does that suggest that you feel that there is no plan? That, once again, we're seeing Trump and his administration playing two different games here?
I think Mr. Fish was exactly correct. I was just laughing because I thought he was being so polite about it. I would argue that the Trump administration has just been all over the place on North Korea, quite honestly. During the war scare in the spring, the Trump administration had something like, if I remember, had like 4 policies within the space of like 9 days, right? They sort of swung from all options on the table to maximum pressure to we're going to talk to them, right? I mean, it would really, really help if the Trump administration had an East Asia staff, which they really don't. We need an ambassador here in South Korea. It's been 6 months or 8 months now since they've been in there. We don't have an ambassador. Right. I mean, the Trump administration needs to take this more seriously, especially if the president's going to go on TV and say stuff like fire and fury. And the whole world took that to mean a threat to start a nuclear war.
Okay,
right?
but he has taken
so,
it seriously. Trump's latest tweet, he says the United States is considering, in addition to other options, stopping all trade with any country doing business with North Korea.
Yeah, that's just another sort of fantastical statement that's just not going to go anywhere, right? I mean, I actually tweeted in response to that myself. I mean, not that the president read it. What I actually tweeted in response, I'm basically saying is China, right? Because 90% of North Korea's trade, 92% actually goes through China, which is an issue I suppose we'll talk about. But right, what does that mean? We're going to embargo China, the world's second largest GDP? I mean, that's just a non-starter. You bring the world economy into a recession if the Americans and Chinese stop interacting economically, right? I mean, the president's got to sort of come out with something more serious, more real. Missile defense is what I think we should be talking about. But we're not going to embargo China. I don't know what that means.
Victor? What was the response there to that tweet? I mean, were there a few heads nodding in agreement? I can't imagine so.
I think President Donald Trump needs to come up with a higher level of sophistication and realism and pragmatism in facing up to the DPRK nuclear weapon program. And first and foremost, President Donald Trump really need to bring along a sense of realism in realizing if you really want to incentivize China to do the right thing on DPRK nuclear program, you cannot antagonize China on other major strategic issues, whereas on the DPRK nuclear weapon issue, you need to get maximum Chinese help. China
do you think this could lead to a backlash if it were to go ahead? Could this lead to a backlash against U.S. business relations?
I hope not. China-U.S. relations, especially in the economic and trade sectors, are so important, and neither China nor the United States want to face up with a prospect of a trade war or so-called embargo against China, for example, because that really will push the world economy into a big recession and resulting in loss of jobs in terms of millions of jobs, possibly, in the United States. Therefore, I hope President Donald Trump will be more educated in his views and positions, and also being the president of the United States, whatever he says or tweets has global implications and consequences, and the DPRK nuclear weapon program is a matter of such utmost importance that it deserves the highest and most sophisticated and careful analysis and decision-making rather than very amateurish and childish play of games on the global stage.
Isaac, do you think that this tweet could gain traction anyway?
I think it's a very absurd tweet, not only because of China's trade with the DPRK, but there are plenty of other countries that are major American trading partners that have trade relations with the DPRK. So it's not only cutting off trade between the U.S. and China, but between the U.S. and a huge swath of the world's economy. So sort of, I mean, it's in a strange way threatening to make America isolated in a way that countries like North Korea and China used to be isolated. It's just a very, very bizarre thing that he and the Treasury Secretary said yesterday. And I think one of the mistakes that we've seen Trump have with regards to China and North Korea is this idea that the United States can go in and tell China, which on many levels is roughly the same level of power as the United States, can go in and just tell China that this is the way we're going to deal with the North Korean issue. And we have to imagine things from Xi's perspective. If the leader of another country says, hey, this is the way that you have to deal with one of your most important relationships, it's hard for him to do it in that way and still maintain face. I mean, if Chinese President Xi Jinping told Donald Trump that this is the way that the U.S. had to deal with, say, Cuba or Mexico, it's hard to imagine Trump being able to publicly swallow that. And I don't think we can expect Xi to just do what Trump says just because Trump is asking him to do so.
Victor, is that one of the reasons why it's quite hard for both the US and China to get onto the same page? I mean, I know that there are years and years of issues behind their not a particularly strong relationship, but could this be one of the factors? And, at the same time, and it's probably happening right now, there's a United Nations Security Council meeting happening, deciding how to go forward as far as North Korea is concerned. And they're looking at sanctions on oil. How does China feel about that, considering how important it is to China and North Korea?
No, I would say that the United Nations Security Council agreed sanctions against DPRK for its violations of the nuclear weapon program agreement are very, very important. And China has always been faithfully abiding by the United Nations Security Council sanctions against DPRK. China's uniqueness is that China insists that to the extent of humanitarian reasons, sanctions should not apply to those goods or services which have a direct bearing on the livelihood and the living standards of the ordinary people in DPRK. And in recent years, I think the Chinese government really has put this all the way to the hilt in terms of implementing the terms, the letters and the spirits of the United Nations Security Council resolutions.
I don't think that's the general feeling, is it, Robert? DPRK. I mean, it's rather opaque when it comes to, how much crude China sells to North Korea, for example. I mean, there are a lot of questions raised about how strong or stringently China sticks to these sanctions, any sanctions.
Yeah. Yes, that is correct. There's a pretty big debate on that. I would argue that the Western analyst community on Korean issues would say that the Chinese are actually not enforcing the sanctions as much as they need to and as much as they could. I don't know if we want to have that sort of debate here and now, but I think there's a pretty strong consensus among sort of the Westerners who work in this stuff and I would say South Koreans too. I mean, I live here and I go to conferences all the time, and I think the South Koreans are also convinced the Chinese can do a great deal more. I've flown into North Korea myself from China, and you can watch people bust the sanctions. They walk right onto the plane with bags full of chocolate and liquor and hair dryers and stuff like that. All that stuff is blocked, and they just let them walk on the plane, right? I mean, I think the bigger issue is not just sort of the goods trade across the rivers. That's obviously sort of a big deal. There's a lot of illicit stuff going on as well. And there's a lot of suspicion that the Chinese look the other way on that. And the other big issue coming down the pipe is North Korean money in Chinese banks, secondary sanctions. If the United States really takes that seriously, it could cause a major rift with the Chinese. But that's probably where we have to go now, because the North Koreans are only going to listen if we start going after their money. We can't bomb them, right? It's been established that we really can't airstrike them. It's way too risky. And so I think we have to start going after their money, or it becomes sort of like a missile defense game, right? Where we just start stacking missile defense in Japan and South Korea because we have no choice, because the North Koreans just aren't going to stop building missiles.
I mean, that's an issue in itself, isn't it, Victor? If South Korea ramps up its nuclear program, Japan gets pushed into changing its pacifist constitution even more. I mean, you wonder where it stops.
Yes, indeed, I would say DPRK's nuclear program and consistent and continued violations of the United Nations Security Council resolutions are a scourge in this part of the world, and it has dire consequences. And I would say, given the recent launch vehicle testing, which flew above Hokkaido in Japan, and the more recent testing of the so-called hydrogen bomb, really have pushed the situation on the Korean Peninsula to the tipping point. And this is really worrying, because going forward, we may directly face the choice of peace and war. And if war does break out, and I sincerely hope it will not, but if it does break out, it will have very, very serious consequences for the people on the Korean Peninsula, but also for the people in this whole part of the world, including in China. So this is no longer a simple matter, a childish matter. This is probably one of the most serious matters in the world today, with a direct bearing on peace and stability, or war and calamity in the world.
Isaac, I mean, do you agree that a military option is possibly off the table because of the horrendous fallout. And if Kim Jong-un has successfully divided those who are standing against him, I mean, what are the options now? Where to from here?
I hope that a military option is off the table. It's very difficult. You know, it's funny having watched Asia for so long and then finally having a leader like Trump who's in many ways as unpredictable as, you know, what we're used to seeing in China and North Korea. So yes, rationally speaking, a military option could have devastating consequences, like Victor said, for people of Korea, for other people in Asia, and for Americans. And frankly, if we do go to war with North Korea, which I hope we never do, we don't know what side China is going to come in on. You know, China will certainly be involved in some way. It's too important of a conflict for them to just step aside, and we don't know where the chips will fall if that were to happen. So
Victor, is China
it's a very,
on the
very
fence
dangerous game
to this
that
extent?
you shouldn't be playing.
No, I think as far as China is concerned, on the one hand, there is a mutual friendship treaty, which is a mutual defense treaty between China and DPRK. Its exact legal status is in limbo. And I think on one occasion, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson basically said that treaty was designed to maintain peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. And if any party will take action which result in destabilizing the situation on the Korean Peninsula, then China may have reason to think twice about what exactly will be the applicability of that particular treaty as far as China is concerned. That's on the one hand. Now, on the other hand, I think equally important, China and the United States are now the two largest economies and most likely the two most powerful countries in the world. And I hope between China and the United States on the DPRK nuclear weapon program, they will see eye to eye on all the major aspects of this particular issue, because any difference between them will be played around by DPRK, and eventually the situation on the Korean Peninsula will be made worse and not better. And therefore, how China and the United States can really better coordinate their action, promoting peace, promoting the peaceful resolution of the nuclear weapon crisis on the Korean Peninsula is of utmost importance.
Robert, Donald Trump, in a tweet, also lashed out at South Korea of its relationship or its actions towards North Korea in the past. We know that that's not going to work, and we know that threatening North Korea doesn't work. So what's going to happen now?
Sure. I think sanctions are often unfairly condemned because I think they're often held to an unfair counterfactual, which is to say that if the sanctions only work, then North Korea wouldn't have nuclear weapons. I don't think that's true. I think a better way to judge sanctions is if we didn't have them, how much further along would North Korea's nuclear program be? Would they have had a hydrogen weapon 5 years ago instead of now? Would they have, 1,000 missiles instead of a couple hundred or something like that? So we have to keep up the sanctions pressure. We need to go back. We need to push the Chinese to really enforce the sanctions. We need to get the Chinese to respect the panel of experts that oversees the multilateral sanctions framework and take it more seriously. That's the first thing. I still do believe that the route to Pyongyang goes through Beijing. If the Chinese won't come around, then it's going to become a sort of measure versus countermeasure arms race in which missile defense is going to be paired off against missiles. The North Koreans can build more missiles. Chinese and the South Koreans are going to have to build more missile defense. The problem is that missile defense per unit is a lot more expensive than missiles. And so if the North Koreans
I'm going to have to cut you off there because I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you very much to my guests, Isaac Stone-Fish, Victor Gao, Robert Kelly. Great conversation. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. Mine is @Jane Dutton. For me and the rest of the team, thanks for watching. Bye-bye. Containing North Korea, the world wrestles with the threat posed by its most powerful nuclear bomb test yet. Does a military response risk World War III? What are the other options? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Jane Dutton. Earlier this week, we spoke of the diplomatic tit-for-tat between the US and Russia. Look to the east, and there's a military one. South Korea has been conducting live fire drills to, quote, strongly warn its northern neighbor, who allegedly launched its largest nuclear test yet over the weekend. North Korea says it detonated a hydrogen bomb underground. It is the country's sixth.
Is expected to further complicate an already delicate and dangerous situation. Wayne Hay, Al Jazeera, Seoul.
A lot of the pressure to contain North Korea falls on China because of the country's reliance on its Chinese neighbor. Coal is North Korea's main export, and most of it goes to China. In fact, the country is estimated to account for 90% of North Korea's foreign trade. In return, the North receives vital resources such as Chinese oil and food. There's concerns that cutting off those imports would hurt North Korean citizens without curtailing Kim Jong-un's nuclear bomb program. Well, to give us more insight on who can really rein in North Koreans' ambitions and all the other issues raised by this latest test, let's bring in our guests. Isaac Stone-Fish, Senior Fellow at the Asia Society Center on US-China.
The South sent a message that it can strike important locations in the North, such as its nuclear test center and its ballistic missile sites, which could carry a nuclear warhead. South Korea's defense ministry says it detected activity at one of those sites, which could indicate another launch is coming soon.
We predict that North Korea could fire another intercontinental ballistic missile to show that they have obtained the means of delivering a nuclear bomb to the United States.
South Korean commanders say there'll be another live fire drill this month, as well as negotiations with the United States to send an aircraft carrier and bombers. The South Korean government knows that direct military action against the North comes with huge risk, but at the same time it feels that a diplomatic response on its own isn't enough, so it wants to put on a show of force. By doing so, South Koreans hope they can pressure their northern neighbor into backing down, something it seems unwilling to do. At the same time, analysts believe it's too late to attack the North.
They have a lot of research facilities. They have produced already a large amount of the nuclear material. Everything is safely hidden, so it's impossible to seriously damage their program but by one or two precision strikes.
South Korea is also improving its defenses and deterrent, announcing the full deployment of the THAAD high-altitude missile interceptor system. The partial deployment of the US batteries in April was met with protests by South Koreans concerned about health and environmental risks. Chinese government leaders also opposed the system they say could be used by the United States to spy on China. South Korea's government says it's needed to protect it from attack by North Korea. But the full deployment of the US missile shield...
Nuclear test blast since 2006. That's led to a UN Security Council emergency meeting, the second one in a week, and they're considering ways to deter North Korea from conducting more tests. But the UNSC has already imposed stiff sanctions on the country, so what else can they do? US President Donald Trump has a few ideas after the latest North Korea test. He tweeted that the United States is considering, in addition to other options, stopping all trade with any country doing business with North Korea. Well, how feasible is that plan, and what other options are on the table? We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, Wayne Hay has this report from Seoul.
Early on Monday morning, South Korea's military responded to the latest agitation from the north. It was a relatively small answer to North Korea's most powerful nuclear bomb test so far. But by firing missiles at practice targets in the east,